Good evening. Welcome to the first lecture in our series on spirituality and the brain. The theme of tonight's talk is God and the brain. And I just want to start off by more or less jumping into it and giving you a fairly straightforward way of arriving at the conclusion that God, whatever that means, and the brain, that is, actually do have a point of connection. If you look at an EEG, an electroencephalogram, something that displays brain waves, and you're eating, you're going to have one set of patterns that appear on it. If you're falling asleep, you're going to have another. If you're running full tilt uphill, you're going to have another set of brainwave patterns. Each human behavior, each way of thinking, gives us a different set of brainwave patterns. So it's not a very big step to think that if you're somehow connected to God, through prayer, through an actual vision of God, by reflecting on the points of your faith in God, your EEG pattern, your brainwave pattern, is still going to have another pattern. This should come regardless of whether you're praying, thinking of God, or even hearing words that remind you of God. So, just from this simple, straightforward way of thinking of it, we arrive at the conclusion that God, whatever that means to you, has some place in your brain or some effect on your brain. The two are not unrelated. And that's an important starting point. If we don't take a moment to consider that, we can kind of get lost in some theological concerns that might come up here. The understanding of the role of God in the brain, or the brain in understanding God, began quite a while ago. But one of the decisive observations about this came from the famous Canadian neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield, who did his best work between the 1940s and the 1960s. And he actually elicited a number of what were called in those days psychical visions, out-of-body experiences, strange and even spiritual moments that came up, not only for his epileptic patients, but also for the patients that he had on the operating table. He would stimulate the surface of their brain, and all sorts of interesting things happened. He's well known for this work. But he also recorded a case where one of his epileptic patients actually had visions of God coming down from the sky, framed as if in a picture. And this was published in the scientific literature, which is what makes it such an important observation. And that one actually ties down the notion that epilepsy, a brain disorder, can have spiritual, even theistic impacts on people. The experience of God can occur during an epileptic seizure. Fyodor Dostoevsky, who wrote about it in his book The Possessed, had seizures that included not so much clear visions of God, but the experience of bliss and ecstasy that was so intense that he couldn't attribute it to anything else. And the next major step forward in this, and I'm skipping by a lot of research by some very excellent people, was accomplished by Dr. Michael A. Persinger, who is director of the Laurentian University Behavioral Neurosciences program and has been my mentor for about 13 years. And he was actually able to induce visions of God in the laboratory. And he used a piece of equipment for this called the Koren helmet, which has also gotten the nickname the God helmet, and we'll be seeing it further along in this talk. One of the things that he did that helped him develop the God helmet, the Koren helmet, was he developed a theory that allowed him to predict that this kind of thing should be possible in laboratory settings. And I'll be getting to the procedures for that in a couple of minutes. His most important contribution to understanding God and the brain, or the science of spirituality, came when he had an insight as to the origins of spirituality in human evolution. Now, when our species first appeared as Homo sapiens, our brains went through a couple of major changes. Actually, we went through lots and lots and lots of changes. But two of the most important were that two areas of the brain became larger. The frontal lobes, which are concerned with the future, anticipation, extrapolation, expectation, planning, especially planning social things, thinking about how you'll relate to other people. And the other is the temporal lobes. Now, the temporal lobes are primarily concerned with memory, but they also have a number of other functions, which I'll be getting to shortly. But for the moment, what I want to get across is that the temporal lobes of the brain are the source for most spiritual experiences, what are called in the scientific literature religious and mystic experiences. And Dr. Persinger knew this because of Dr. Wilder Penfield's work, as well as the many reports that come from people with temporal lobe epilepsy that contained spiritual themes, comments, visions, and so forth. Not a lot of that got into publication in the early days because the scientific community was not as open to it as they are now. And what Dr. Persinger realized was that the only way we could understand the facts of our death is to think about it. No one, with the exception of very few people who've had near-death experiences, who've been dead and come back, been resuscitated or revived after being dead, has been dead. So the only way that most people can understand that they're going to die is to think about it and arrive at the verbal construction, I will die. And from there, think about it and take it a bit personally. And it works in lots of different ways, and one of them is something like this. That person has a father. Their father died. That person has a father. Their father died. I'm a father. Uh-oh, it's going to happen to me too. This person got old and then they died. Another person got old and then they died. I look in the stream. In those days there probably were no mirrors. We're talking early in our evolutionary history. And I look in and see that I've got wrinkled skin and I've got gray hairs. And oh my, I'm going to die too. Taking it personally is very different from understanding the fact of death. Engaging the thought that one's own person will die takes some time. And every parent has the moment when their 3 or 4-year-old asks them, Daddy, does everyone have to die? That's the moment when they're beginning to take it personally. And the reason that human beings can do this, and especially at such an early age, my own child asked me this question when she was 3, is because the temporal lobes are now more able to remember more kinds of information and process our memories far more extensively than we had earlier in our evolutionary history. The frontal lobes are now able to extrapolate into the future in more ways and in more abstract ways than they had been previously. So this very actually, from the point of view of your average 3-year-old, unlikely experience, that of personal death, can be arrived at as a conclusion. And so people tend to know that they're going to die. Now, we tend to suppress these thoughts, and this suppression is buttressed by nearly every religious tradition in existence, which tell us that we're not going to die. We're going to move on. Death is not death. Death is an awakening. Death is a transition to the spirit world. Death is going home. Death is to be with the gods. Death is to join our Father in heaven. But no matter how the religions process this, and there seems to be no culture on this earth that does not have a religion that has this concept embedded in it somewhere, we are allowed to suppress the fact of our own personal mortality. And what this does is reduces death anxiety. Now, death anxiety is a very good thing because it allows us, it encourages us to think of all the different ways that we can be killed and avoid them. So if we understand that jaguars live high in the trees and we're walking through the forest, we're more likely to take a look up once in a while and make sure there's nothing there that offers a threat. If famine takes lives and the water supply gets scarce and we know that makes it hard to find food, then we're more likely to take notice of any unlikely food sources that we would have passed by earlier. And if the food supply does run out, we know where to go to get something that isn't so appetizing, but at least will keep us nourished. So we anticipate ways of dying and we avoid them. This helps us survive. But the stress involved in continually being aware of your own personal death can be quite unnerving. If you think that you can think of your own personal death without any stress or psychological discomfort, Try the next step below it and see how that feels. Pretend your doctor has told you you've just got terminal cancer. See how that feels. If you have no personal stress about the moment of death, it's probably because you've really taken on board that you're not going to die, as offered by your religion. So, spirituality extends our lives by helping us live with less stress, live without the stress that goes with death anxiety, at the same time as we can maintain a regular awareness of the fact and the reality of death and take steps to avoid it. And that is a very complicated arrangement for a mind of any kind to live with. But human evolution has allowed us the luxury of staying alive and allowed us the luxury of not being worried about dying. And that makes life very much easier to live and makes it last a bit longer than it would otherwise. So Dr. Michael Persinger concluded that we're predisposed to be in a healthy kind of denial about the fact of our own deaths. And the experience of God, the first-hand vision of God, what the Hindus call darshan, what some Christians call the unio mystica, is a real enough experience that we can begin by accepting that it happens to some people, that all the people that have said they have met God face to face aren't lying. They're actually giving what scientists can take on board as anecdotal reports. And an important question is, why are our brains able to produce this experience? One answer is that there actually is a God, a creator of the universe who has a personal relationship with each one of us, and that we are able to connect to through God's will. The other possible explanation, the one that I'm going to be working with tonight, is that our brains are able to produce this experience for us. And that brings an immediate question. Why? It's a very unlikely thing to imagine that our brains are predisposed through their wiring and that we are able, through our evolutionary history, to have a face-to-face meeting with what feels to us like the creator of the universe, the source of love and bliss and acceptance and all the glorious attributes that go with God. And the answer is, we're wired for it. It happens naturally during the death process, and the evidence for this is in near-death experiences. And it's important for me to say now that I accept near-death experiences not as any kind of brain blips or a malfunction of the brain that happens when we're dying. I think that near-death experiences actually reveal to us the death process as experienced by human beings. What people tell us when they tell us about their near-death experiences or when we read about them in the many books on the subject actually reflects something from the wide range of possibilities that people have for their own individual deaths. And the experience of God is probably more common in that context than in any other context. Hundreds, thousands of monks and nuns have prayed to meet God face to face, and their prayers, for whatever reason, have gone unanswered. Hundreds of people, thousands of people, have died and come back to life and reported meeting God, and they never prayed for it at all. So I think that the process that much more reliably produces the direct experience of God is a better place to look for evidence about the experience than the world's religious traditions. And what we have on the screen now is a picture of the Karen helmet, also known as the God helmet. And this is the apparatus that's used to produce experiences of God. And next to it we have a picture of Stan Koren, who actually developed the first one, working with Dr. Michael Persinger. And to start off explaining how the brain produces the experience of God, I need to tell you that according to Dr. Persinger's hypotheses and theories, we actually have two senses of self, one for each side of the brain. The self on the left side of the brain, where the language centers are, is the linguistic sense of self. That's the self that thinks in words and the self that is impacted upon by words. It's the dominant sense of self. It's the self that we usually are in most of our waking moments, in what scientists call normal states of consciousness. The self on the right side of the brain is a much more silent sense of self. There are no language centers on the right side of the brain. And what that means is that for us to be in normal states of consciousness where our linguistic skills are available for us to relate to other people, we're a linguistic species. We use words. We have a constant stream of inner dialogue. But we're also a social species, and we primarily relate to other people through words. This may not be the highest form of relating, but it's the most common form, and it's the one that you use when you're applying for a job, when you're saying hello to your neighbor, when you're having the ordinary garden variety day-to-day relatings that make up our social reality. So we have to be the linguistic self in order that we can be integrated with other people. And the usual way to integrate with other people is one way or another through our cultures. And our cultures demand that we be able and available for linguistic tasking, able and available to use words or in relating to other people at any time. Now, the other thing about the linguistic sense of self, and here we have an illustration that shows you the two senses of self on the two sides of the brain, as well as the language centers, Broca's area and Wernicke's area. For those of you who are interested, Broca's area produces speech and Wernicke's area understands speech. And ordinarily, these two senses of self are quite seamlessly integrated, so that even though we are this sense of self on the left, we get lots and lots of input all the time from the sense of self on the right. And when I say self in this context, I mean the word in a sense that matches the phrase self-esteem, so that our self-esteem rises and falls according to the words that we hear. If someone says to you, "You're cute," we feel a bit better about ourselves. If our boss says, "You're fired," we feel terrible. If another employer says, "You're hired," we feel great once again. Our self-esteem impacts on our emotions, and there's very few things that go on in the inner landscape of the human consciousness than our emotions. Almost nothing looms larger. And our emotions change radically according to the words that we hear. And this is an important piece of understanding to take on board, to understand that we are our linguistic sense of self. We are the left hemispheric one as the dominant sense of self. Now, ordinarily, like I said, the two work together quite seamlessly, but once in a while communication between the two breaks down, which appears in this illustration as having the lines that connect them sort of broken up a bit. And this can happen for a number of reasons. The communication between the hemispheres can lose its coherence. They can fall out of phase with one another. One hemisphere, because of some circumstance, can stop working as well as the other. And we can find that for a moment we don't feel quite intact. We absorb ourselves in a book, and then someone calls to us and we have to pull our attention out. And there's a brief moment where we sort of collect ourselves and bring ourselves back to that social being that we have to be in order not to be alone with the book, but rather connecting and relating to someone else. The relating is not completely automatic, and in moments when we have to grope for it, though we can find, if you're looking carefully enough, that your sense of self is kind of broken up a little bit. Now, when the two actually fall out of phase or lose their coherence in a more extreme way, both of them continue to operate, but one of them is no longer available for us. It's broken its communication with the other. And what happens is that it's perceived as a separate being that exists outside of ourselves, outside of our body's space. And this creates the basis for a whole class of experiences called visitor experiences. And visitor experiences are any kind of experience where we're actually being visited or communicating with or even just seeing a non-physical being. And in its very mildest form, it's called the sensed presence. And it refers to the reasonably ordinary experience. Not everyone gets it, but most people have had it a few times, a feeling that there's someone standing behind you, but when you turn to look, there's no one there. And when you feel that presence in that moment, what you're actually feeling is your subordinate sense of self emerging into the awareness of your dominant sense of self, so that in that moment you are actually, in a kind of existential sense, two beings at once. The most intense of these is God, and now we're back to the God helmet, the Karen helmet. And the way it works is it applies signals, magnetic signals, that are derived from electrical signals that either come from the brain or have an impact on the brain. It relies on the same kinds of mechanisms that produce any other visitor experience. Disconnecting or getting the two sides of the brain to work, getting them to perform and act independently of one another. And it works by applying magnetic copies of electrical signals that either come from the brain through EEG or that the brain is known to respond to. And I'll be saying more about those signals in a moment. One of the signals is derived from the amygdala, a structure deep in the brain, deep in the temporal lobes of the brain. It's a very, very active structure. It never shuts down completely, and it actually uses more blood than any other part of the brain. It has lower firing thresholds than any other part of the brain. It takes less electrical input to get the amygdala to respond than any other part of the brain. And the amygdala is a very social structure. It helps us relate to other people. When we look at other people and their facial expressions, it tells us what other people's moods are. It changes in most mood disorders. Nearly any emotional disorder will have an amygdala that's larger or smaller on one side or the other. Sometimes the differences can be quite dramatic. It carries emotional memories. Most memories are embedded, retrieved, preserved, consolidated, and created in different areas of the brain. But the amygdala is actually capable of remembering things that have sparked strong emotional responses to us, what we call emotional memories. Now, the amygdala is very highly specialized. On one side of the brain, according to the research at Laurentian under Dr. Persinger, which isn't the same as some others, on one side, on the right side, it produces fear, and in its own independent action, the amygdala on the right can produce a state of fear that's so intense that people feel a sense of impending doom. And the amygdala on the left is specialized for positive emotions, things like elation, happiness, joy, and even the kind of bliss that we associate with religious ecstasy. The way the Karen helmet works, I'll be getting to in just a minute. But for now, let me go over very briefly the experiences that the Karen helmet has been able to produce. Visions of God, out-of-body experiences, seeing into a black inner space that's been nicknamed the void, which can also occur in near-death experiences. And here we have actually three pictures. One of them is Stan Karen wearing the latest version of his apparatus. One of them is the yellow Karen helmet, the one that was used in so many experiments. And then the one on the right is a commercially available device, which you can learn about at www.spiritualbrain.com, known as Shakti, which is a Hindu word that just means energy and is also the name of a goddess. Other people have had visions of angels, visions of demons, moments of bliss, terror, seen lights, including little floaty lights, and had very powerful tingly electrical sensations running through their body. So the God helmet does not produce visions of God. It produces lots and lots and lots of altered states, and visions of God constitute only one of them. And in order to use this or any other technology to produce an experience that's as dramatic as that, you actually need reasonably precise experimental conditions. Above all, this means complete silence. We see Dr. M.A. Persinger entering the acoustic chamber, the absolutely silent chamber, as well as a computer at the bottom of that picture running a program called Complex, which is authored by Stan Karen, and which drives a computer to actually produce the signal. The commercial device, Shakti, works with an ordinary computer sound card. The coils for the Karen helmet, the magnetic coils, are located over the temporal lobes. This isn't the arrangement, but seen from above, this picture shows approximately where those magnetic coils go, above the temporal lobes, which is located directly above the ears to about 2 inches above the ears. And as I mentioned earlier, the temporal lobes are the source for most spiritual, religious, and mystic experiences. At least that's what the brain stimulation evidence is telling us, and that kind of evidence continues to mount up rather impressively. There are, in fact, several session designs that created spiritual experiences in Dr. Persinger's lab using this kind of technology, and here we're only going to look at the most successful one. In the first phase, a signal is applied over the right side of the brain, and the signal that's used is actually called a chirp signal. And a chirp signal is one that just gets a lower pitch as it goes along, so that the beginning of the chirp signal could be several octaves above middle C, and yet within a quarter of a second it could take it down to 2 octaves below middle C, that rapidly falling pitch. And this signal is repeated for about half an hour. And the second phase of this procedure, now let me stay with the first phase for a moment. In this phase of the procedure, the right side of the brain is getting a stimulation that the left side is not getting. And that sets the stage for the two of them to function differently, to fall out of phase, for their normal communication to be a bit disrupted. And as I mentioned earlier, that's one of the prerequisites for any kind of visitor experience, whether it's a simple sense of a presence or an actual vision of God. The second phase of this procedure, which you can see somewhat simplistically illustrated, shows that another signal is now being applied across the head, and so that the entire brain is being exposed to it. This signal is derived from the amygdala, an EEG signal taken from deep in the brain that showed that the amygdala was working, was taken, turned into a magnetic signal so that the magnetic field rises and falls in the same pattern that the electrical activity, the raw millivoltage, because we're talking about very small amounts of electricity here, the same rises and falls in millivoltage made for its pattern, so that the electrical signal is now being applied as a magnetic signal, not an electromagnetic signal. Electromagnets are used to produce the signal, but electromagnetic frequencies are something very different. These signals are in very low frequencies, and electromagnetic output, like your microwave oven, is a different beast altogether. This is related to the safety of these studies, but this technology is not like putting a microwave on your head. It's more like putting a pair of stereo headphones on your head. Stereo headphones output magnetic fields that rise and fall with the music, and actually in roughly the same intensity as the signals used in the laboratory. But the signals in the lab have very specific patterns, and the ones that you expose your brain to when you're listening to music with headphones don't have these patterns. They have whatever patterns come from the music. So what happens with the second phase of this procedure is that the amygdala, which has gotten on the left, which has gotten more and more quiet as the one on the right became more and more active, is now given information that allows it to burst into activity. And compensating for this, the amygdala on the right gets much quieter. So that now the left amygdala, the one that is specialized for bliss, joy, elation, and so forth, can burst suddenly into activation, and the result is a visitor experience with a positive feel. If the person is sensitive enough to this kind of stimulation, if their amygdala is more sensitive than most, and not all brain parts are equally sensitive in all people, this explains a great deal about personality differences, the person can actually find the experience unfolding into a vision of God. And what I'm going to do now is read to you a brief email that I got from Dr. Persinger himself. I sent him an email asking how many people, what percent of the total subjects that he had worked with had experienced God in his laboratory. And the reason I like to put this in is because the technology that's used is called the Karen helmet. The God helmet is a name that journalists gave it with their love of sensationalism. always wanting to give the most flamboyant name to anything they run into in a laboratory. And on being asked what % of people experience God in the lab, Dr. Persinger replied, "So thus far, about 20 or so people have reported feeling the presence of Christ or even seeing him in the chamber, the acoustic chamber where the experiment took place. Most of these people use Christ and God interchangeably. Most of these individuals were older, 30 years or more, and religious, predominantly Roman Catholic. One male, age about 35 years old, allegedly atheist, but having early childhood Roman Catholic training, saw a clear apparition, the shoulders and the head of Christ staring him in the face. He was quite shaken by the experience. I did not complete a follow-up regarding his change in behavior. Of course, these are all reports. What we did find with one world-class psychic who experiences Christ as a component of his reported experience, that by applying another pattern derived from a different brain part, the hippocampus, which I'll be talking about shortly, over the right hemisphere, in contrast to the left used in these experiments, without his awareness, the field-on response, meaning when the signal was present, was about 10 to 20 seconds. And after that 10 to 20 seconds, their ability to do their psychic readings went up, and so did the accuracy of their readings. Now, just again to look at the neural effects, the effects in the brain of the process of seeing God, it starts with activity in the right amygdala, as you can see in this illustration. By itself, right amygdala activation can lead to a feeling of impending doom, terror, or even despair. And it happens in the laboratory with the first phase of these experiments that a lot of people do go into fear. Not as intense as you would get if the right amygdala were entirely active and everything else nearby were shut down. But they can still go into some real states of extreme anxiety and apprehensiveness. So that's the first phase of the session. The second one, we find the activity has been shunted over amygdala, the round purple structure here, and that gets you the experience of bliss, sometimes light, and sometimes God. And that's worth spending a moment discussing. The experience of light. Everywhere you go in the world, God is made of light. In Western tradition, God is radiant. He is resplendent. He has a halo. He has an aura. He glows. He is glorious. And the word glorious just means surrounded by light. The sudden activation produces the experience of God in about 1%. When Dr. Persinger told me that 20 or so people had experienced God, I knew from my previous conversations with him that the number of people who had experienced the procedure overall was about 2,000. Now, in contrast, 80% of the subjects felt a presence of some kind. Not God, nothing so intense as that, but just simply running the range from a friendly spirit to a simple sense of a presence. And when they tried to turn around to look, they found no one there. It would have been an exercise in futility because, as it happens, they wore blindfolds anyway. But the full range of visitor experience, God, angels, sense presence, and even demons have been produced using this technology. There was a case history that Dr. Persinger published where one of his colleagues regularly experienced a ghost. Dr. Persinger brought him into the acoustic chamber, put the helmet on him, cranked up Complex, the software authored by Stan Koren, and was able to get the guy into a state of consciousness where he re-experienced his ghost in the laboratory. And this wasn't a comfortable experience, but it did reassure the man that he wasn't being chased by demons. He wasn't cursed by God. He wasn't in the middle of, what's the phrase, a blip in the protosymplastic infundibulum. He was actually experiencing a projection from his own mind. And that made it very much easier for him to live with his ghostly experiences when they happened to him after that. Now, in talking about God, there's a point that I need to make, because some people who watch this will have very deep and heartfelt religious faith in God. And no amount of words or scientific evidence that I could ever present will prove to them or even convince them that it's worth thinking about whether or not God might exist only in their brains. Meanwhile, there are other people who will see this, who will believe that it's nothing but the brain. And in order to treat both of them even-handedly, I want to say that there's nothing in this line of evidence that proves that there's a God. There's nothing in this line of evidence that proves that there isn't a God. If there is a creator of the universe who exists outside of me, and I experience his presence, is God working through my brain to come into my awareness? Or is my brain working to produce my sense of God's presence outside of my body? There's absolutely no evidence that we've got that will move the needle in either direction. If you believe in God, you can think about the scientific evidence, and I, for one, am not going to tell you to give up your faith. If you don't believe in God and you're watching this because you want a little more to buttress or to reassure your atheism, I'm not going to tell you anything that will move you away from it. There is no proof available that there is a God and no proof available that there isn't. So I hope that everyone who sees this takes that point to heart and doesn't feel that what I have to say offers a challenge to their religion. I want neuroscience to help people develop spiritually, to help them bring as much joy in their lives as spirituality can bring, and that's quite a lot. I'm not here to prove that anyone who believes in God is wrong. If anything, I would rather prove that believing in God is a very good thing to do. It doesn't matter whether there's a God outside for you to believe in. The power of your prayers can shape your own minds, even if it doesn't change the world around you. And there's actually getting to be some evidence that it can change the world around you. So, if there is a God, and it's only in your brain, it's your God, and you're free to work out your own spiritual beliefs. You're free to engage whatever is most beautiful or compelling or engaging or uplifting about God as you conceive that God, regardless of whether it's from within your brain or from the universe at large. I can't tell you what my own private beliefs about these things are, partly because I can't put them into words, and also partly because every time I find myself saying, I believe this or that, I soon find myself thinking of something where I'm believing something that isn't quite this or that. But I do like to say that for me, sometimes, the only sacred thing is choice, the only sin is certainty, the only ethics is responsibility, and the only morality is love. And that is good spirituality, whether you believe in God or not. So let's move on. We're now back with the temporal lobes, which, including the deeper parts, are the source for religious and spiritual experiences. Now, Dr. Persinger has studied the temporal lobes and their role in spirituality extensively and published many papers on the subject. For those who want more information or somewhere to go to look for more, you can always go to www.pubmed.com and punch in the name Persinger, Persinger, as a search string, and you'll find many papers on the subject. One of them, one of the most important, is entitled Religious and Mystic Experiences as Artifacts of Temporal Lobe Function. And that's the one where he states his hypothesis quite clearly and openly. And one of the things that paper says is that the actual religious or mystic experience is evoked by a transient, lasting no more than a few seconds, very focal, confined to a small area, electrical display within the temporal lobes. And what later research found was that the area in the temporal lobes that this is most likely to come from is our friend the amygdala. Now, the next question a thinking person might ask me, and I'm sure that you are a thinking person, is why is the brain wired to produce the experience of God? It's easy to explain how our evolution brought us to binocular vision, how we came to walk upright. It's easy to explain our complex cultures and our reliance on one another. For our survival. It's easy to explain how we turned the higher primate language of gestures and grimaces into actual spoken language. But if the capacity to experience God firsthand, face to face, is a human behavior, then how on earth did this rather unlikely thing get wired into our brains? Where did it appear in our evolutionary history? And the answer is that, I believe, it plays a role in the experience of death. And I believe that the death process is revealed, made explicit through near-death experiences. Again, near-death experiences are not brain accidents that happen at the moment of death. They actually reflect what it's like to die, not for any one person, but taking them all together. It gives the whole range of experiences that are possible for all humans, and they do fall into certain patterns, suggesting that some common underlying mechanism is at work for everyone. And near-death experiences go into several phases. The first of my slide here shows the most common of them, a simple out-of-body experience. The person's out of their body and looking down at their body, and this allows them, I think, to know that they're dead. The first part of the near-death experience, the death process, begins before we actually die, before we actually start going into biological or clinical death. And that's the emotion that comes just before death. There are two main emotions that are possible when you think you're going to die. When you're standing in the street and the bus is careening down at you at top speed, and you know there's no chance to get out of the way. You've fallen off the top of a mountain, but you haven't hit the ground yet. And in that intervening period, you know you're going to die. And there are two main emotions that can come up in this moment, and both of them arise out of activation in the right hemisphere. The one most common, especially early in our evolutionary history, was fear. The moment of death is upon us. It is moving towards us with extreme speed, and we start looking for ways to get out of it. So we go into terror. We go into that sense of impending doom, and we start thinking of any way we can to get out of the way of the threat. So one emotion is fear, and here an illustration shows the person falling. There's nothing they can do about it. The umbrella has failed. They're in a state of fear. The other emotion that's possible is a calm state of surrendered acceptance. And this is much more common when people know well in advance that they're going to die. They've been lying on a hospital bed in the intensive care unit, knowing that they're in the final stages of something for quite a while. They've had time to reflect on their lives, to engage the inevitability of their deaths. They begin to make peace with it. And then there comes a moment which Elizabeth Kubler-Ross calls acceptance. And from then on, it's okay to die. And there have been many people who have called in Dr. Kubler-Ross and said, something happened last night. I came to a new understanding. I don't want to die, but I am dying, and it's okay somehow. And their family goes to visit them, and they find that instead of raging and raging against the dying of the light, they have relaxed into the inevitability and have begun to find a bit of the divine, a bit of the sacred in the promise. And some of them can even begin to look forward to dying. I once had a job in a nursing home, and there were many, many people there, I would say all of them, who were extremely close to their deaths. The move into the nursing home was the last life change they would ever experience. And there was one old man who jumped out of his bed every 5 minutes in a state of extreme terror, at a complete loss for words. The calm and acceptance comes out of the right hemisphere. The absolute terror comes out of the right hemisphere as well, but from two different brain parts. The terror from the amygdala, the calm and the acceptance from the hippocampus. And he would find himself at a loss for words and he would come out with words that came to his mind automatically. I don't know from where, but the words were, "Mommy, Mommy, put me to bed, Mommy." I was the maintenance man at the time, and I would take him gently by the arm and lead him back to his bed. He would get back in his bed and he would say, "Thank you, Mom." This wave of what I imagine was an extreme, almost death anxiety would come over him. There was another patient there who sat in a room all day in a wheelchair with folded hands, with one of the most serene countenances I have ever seen. And I have a little bit of spiritual sensitivity myself, and I found that my mood would shift whenever I went into her room. It was my job to mop the floor of every room every day. And I found that I would have to stop and hold the mop for a second and just take a breath before I went into her room. Not because I didn't want to disturb her calm, but because I wanted to take it in for myself. And one day I asked her, you know, I've been in your room a number of times and I always find you in the same place, sitting in exactly the same posture. Is it all right if I ask you what you're feeling? And this smile came over her face and said, just calm, just peacefulness. And I said, all the time? She said, yes. Sometimes they give me food that I don't like, and that bothers me a little bit. But other than that, I'm just calm. All the time? Yes, all the time. Wow. May I go out thusly. So the first phase of the near-death experience is the emotion that we feel when death is approaching. And both of them are located on the right hemisphere, in the right hemisphere of the brain. And that brings us to the next phase of near-death experience, which most researchers take as being the first phase. And that is, not in every case, and it's largely absent in a few cultures, but it's the out-of-body experience. And in this slide you will see on the right an illustration of kind of a classical near-death experience, out-of-body experience. Not an OBE, but an AOBE. And the A stands for autoscopic, meaning to see yourself. Auto is self, and scopic is to see. So very often out-of-body experiences in near-death experiences involve leaving the body, or feeling or seeing that you have left your body, and looking down to see your own corpse. And I think that this has a function, and the function is to tell you that you are dead. If you leave your body, you might confuse it with a state that might come up in a very, very unusual dream. You might confuse it with something you might have heard of called astral travel. You might wonder if it is, as Ebenezer Scrooge says, a bad bit of beef poorly digesting in the stomach. But if you look down and you see your own body, your own hair color, your own hairline, your own skin tone, any scars, you can identify it as you, and you say, my God, that's me. And you knew that just soon before that you were anticipating death, either in seconds with terror or over days, hopefully coming to a sense of surrender and acceptance. You will recognize the out-of-body experience as the first phase of the death process. And in this slide, which I'll ask you to think about just a little more, there are several areas of the brain that are shown. One of them, above the illustration of the out-of-body experience, is a red dot towards the back of the brain. And that spot is the angular gyrus. And in 1992, a Swedish researcher, an epileptologist named Dr. Olof Blanke, stimulated an out-of-body experience in an epileptic patient, a 34-year-old woman actually. And he put an electrode on that spot on her brain. His job was to find the starting point for her epileptic seizures. And when he touched that spot, the woman went out of her body. And he did it 2 or 3 times and kept getting the same result. And this implicates the right angular gyrus, which is a name that most people don't have in their working vocabularies, as the center for out-of-body experiences. And lots of journalists took that on board as well. Now, over to the left side of the diagram, we see a couple of areas that are filled in red. And those are areas which Wilder Penfield stimulated, producing out-of-body experiences. And the one that's forward in the brain, that is to say to the viewer's right, is at the top of the, or just below the Sylvian fissure. And when he stimulated this area, one of his patients said, "Oh God, I'm leaving my body." Another one that he stimulated an out-of-body experience for by hitting the area that's shown towards the back of the brain, to the left, said, "I feel like I'm floating away." There was another researcher who said that one of their patients reported being in 2 places at once, in their body and out of their body at the same time. And the first question everybody wants to ask about out-of-body experiences is, are they real? There's a scientific word for this, veridical. Are they veridical? Do they actually happen? When you're having an out-of-body experience, are you, whatever that means, actually out of, whatever that means, your body? And the answer is, apparently, you are. There's very scanty evidence about this. Really, there's almost nothing for real science to grab hold to in the way of solid evidence. But not everyone who asks this question is trying to do real science. Some people just want to know what happened to them in their out-of-body experiences. And the answer is that there are several reports of people having out-of-body experiences and seeing things when they were out of their body that they couldn't have seen at any other time. So one woman had a cardiac arrest in an intensive care unit on an upper floor of a hospital in Seattle. And when she was out of her body, floated out of her room and was hovering around near her bed, she moved up from that position and looked down and saw a red tennis shoe on a ledge. She called in her nurse and told her what had happened and wanted to know if that red tennis shoe was real. Because if it was, it meant that this life doesn't end with death. So the nurse got a maintenance man who got a key, and the nurse took a key to the roof, and they went up to the roof and found a red tennis shoe, which is why there is a picture of a red shoe in the lecture on neuroscience. The illustration on the left of this panel shows an out-of-body experience that was drawn by a 7-year-old girl who also swore that her out-of-body experiences were absolutely real. Doesn't really contribute much, but an illustration by a small child is always engaging. And it's worth noting that this child enjoyed her out-of-body experiences very much. Nothing frightening about them. So I think that there are such things as real out-of-body experiences. In India and Asia, many near-death experiences do not begin with out-of-body experiences. There, they begin with visitations from servants of Yama, the lord of the underworld, and they're called Yamatuts in Southeast Asia. In India, they're called Yamduds, and both words take their name from Yama, the rather imposing lord of the underworld that we'll be looking at in just a moment. And these would be visitors who would appear and tell the person verbally that they're dead, and tell them verbally that they're there to take them to the underworld, and they are indeed, as Shakespeare put it, fell sergeants, strict in their arrest. Quite uncompromising, no room for negotiation. I think that in the West, in Europe, they may once, near-death experiences, the death process may have once begun with visitations from the Grim Reaper, because the Grim Reaper is in the cultural mind. It's what people kind of expected at the moment of death, as people expect Yamatuts and Yamduds in Asia and India. Now, in the West, in Europe, the Grim Reaper probably served the same kind of function that Yamatuts and Yamduds serve in Asia and in India. It is the cultural image of the arrival of death that was most common at the time, and that everyone saw probably a whole bunch of times in the course of their lives. In those days, preachers of whatever denomination, even after the Protestant Reformation, were much more likely to remind people of their personal deaths and quote things like, "O son, observe the time and fly from evil, ask not for whom the bell tolls," and so forth, than our religions are today. Our culture's sanitization of death, in which it's literally a crime for a dead body to appear in some places, has actually gotten us away from the common familiarity of death that they have in some cultures. In India to this day, dead bodies are carried through the streets on stretchers by groups of mourners on their way to the burning ghats, and passers-by stop and make the namaste gesture, and I'm not sure whether they're showing respect to the dead person or to the mourners, or they're offering prayers to God. But this is an everyday sight in India. When I was there, I actually found myself in a taxi cab, and the taxi cab was held up by a funeral procession. The dead body was carried not 8 inches from my face out the taxi cab window. I looked at the driver and said, "How long will we be here?" And the driver said, "However long it takes." "That guy's dead, right?" "Yeah." "What's the big deal?" I said, "Oh, well, new experience for me in your country." The driver turned back to me and gave me a big smile and says, "Yes, here in India, Living includes dying. No problem. So the image of the death process that is offered to you most often by your culture is probably the one that will initiate your death. And if what you have as the most pointed death image is that of a dead body, then in order for you to see that when you die, you have to leave your body and look down at your own corpse, and so see it that way. So that the Yamatoots, the Grim Reapers, and the autoscopic out-of-body experience all serve the same function, or rather are all based on the same function, initiating an image that you will recognize as meaning death to you. The next phase of the death process, the next phase of near-death experiences, we see in this slide. And on the right, we see a fairly common-looking tunnel experience, a dark tunnel with a kind of honeycomb pattern on the sides of the walls. This is actually the one that I've read of in books and scientific journal articles on near-death experiences most often, this kind of description. The one on the lower right is actually a pencil drawing of a tunnel experience made by a near-death experiencer named Ishtan Nataranjan, who had an experience. He is from India, and I'm not sure where he was when he had it, but he had a tunnel, although commonly tunnels do not occur in near-death experiences reported from India. Now, this isn't the only thing that can come in this phase. For others, the next phase can be an experience that has gotten the name of the void. And the void is a black space, but it's more than just a black space. It is a vibrant, alive, electrical place. You touch nothing, but there is a texture. You hear nothing, but there is a sound. You're understanding nothing from it. It isn't talking to you. And yet, to be in that space, to be faced with this void, creates a tremendous feeling of being in a larger realm and of understanding of something profound. It doesn't happen in all cases, but my point here is that the void is more than just an experience of emptiness or blackness or blankness. This illustration shows it with a tiny point of light in the center. And that point of light is common in near-death experiences. I actually experienced it myself when I had temporal lobe epilepsy as a child. I no longer have it now. Pediatric temporal lobe epilepsy usually disappears with the onset of puberty. My seizures also included out-of-body experiences, strange nighttime visions where shadows rearranged themselves into the shapes of animals, in one case a full-grown cow. And that point of light moves seamlessly into the next phase of near-death experiences, into the next phase of the death process, which appears differently in Asian and Indian cultures as from how it appears in Western cultures. So we're going to go there first. And this is a vision from the underworld, this illustration. It shows people climbing trees covered with spikes. And what's being shown here is Thai hell, hell as understood by the people of Thailand. Being forced to climb a tree covered with spikes while being tormented by demons is actually the special hell for people who've committed sexual offenses during their life. And to the right, you'll see a comic panel where a man is climbing a spiky tree, again for sexual offenses. Behind him is Yama, the lord of the underworld, and the tree is telling him to keep climbing because trees are believed to have spirits. And I'm not so much showing you that for the joke as it is to underscore how common these images are in Southeast Asia. They appear in posters, comic books. I once saw a safety picture for motorcycles. Had two pictures. One, the motorcycle was weaving wildly in and out of traffic with a Yamatoot as a passenger, and in the other, the motorcycle was staying in lane, and it had an angel as its passenger. The moral being that if you weave in and out, you're going to meet the Yamatoot, and if you stay safe, the angel will protect you. Now, this is what you get in what's commonly taken as a third phase of near-death experiences. In the West, it's much simpler. You enter the light. And within the light, You will often meet dead friends and relatives. You will see people you've known who have died. And this underscores that you are dead. In order to meet them, you have to be dead because they're dead. But you're in the light, and the light is bliss, and the light is joy, and the light is acceptance, and it's happiness so great and so subtle that no words can ever convey it. In Thailand and Southeast Asia, you're meeting people who are dead and therefore in the realm of the dead, the underworld. In the West, you're meeting people who are dead and they are in the realm of the dead, heaven. And in heaven, after you've met dead friends and relatives, you meet the being of light. Now, this illustration is probably my favorite picture of God. And there's no anthropomorphic image. There's no God-like, there's no deified person sitting in the marble throne at the center at all. There is nothing but a blast of light, that radiant, resplendent, glorious attribute of God by which God and only God can be defined. It takes it so far out of the human realm that this picture actually shows us that the experience of being with God goes beyond anything that words can express, both for the glory, the light, the majesty, the power, as well as His role sitting in the center of heaven, that realm where to be there alone is bliss. The Thai images, by the way, come from a 12th century text, and this illustration shows the cover of a contemporary edition. It's the Book of Pra Malai. And Pra Malai was a 12th century Thai monk. He may not have been Thai, but his book comes from the 12th century and is published, stays in print in Thailand. And he had visions of heaven and hell, just like Dante. And just like Dante, his heaven was heavenly and his hell was extremely hellish, being filled with different specific tortures for people who had committed different kinds of sin. The hell of having your tongue torn out is for liars. The hell of having to drink molten lava is for drinkers. The hell of being chopped to pieces is for butchers and people who killed animals or other people for that matter. And his vision of the center of the underworld, the actual core experience of being in the underworld, is shown in this illustration, where you will see people standing before Yama, the lord of the underworld. And he is the rather imposing-looking fellow of the illustration on the left. And you'll see him with the Book of Karma next to him, sitting on a throne supported by skulls. And in the illustration on the right, you'll see a set of scales there. And the scales have two captions. One says sin, bun, and the other says, one says sin, bap, and the other says merit, bun. And according to where the scales tip, whether you have more bun than bap, more merit than sin, you are assigned to your next reincarnation. Or perhaps if you are very virtuous, you might get a tour of heaven. Now, this is a kind of unusual manifestation of what near-death experience researchers have called the life review. And in the life review, you can re-experience your whole life in just a few seconds. You can see your entire life flash before your eyes. And I know of two cases where people have stood in rooms with one large wall covered in television screens, with each screen replaying a moment of their lives. And in contrast, in Southeast Asia and India, I believe, instead of reviewing your life is reviewed for you. Other people look at your behaviors in what has come to be called the Book of Karma. And in the Book of Karma, there are records of your deeds. And on the right-hand side, you can see an illustration of what's the Thai near-death experience is called an accountant, looking for your name in the book. And if it's not there, they tell the Yamatut that they grab the wrong man and take him back to the upper world, take him back to the real world. And if the name is there, their sins are read out to them. Usually the person does not have their entire lives reviewed in this way. They will rather just simply have a single episode shown to them as though it might symbolize an entire lifetime of sinful behavior patterns. But in either case, whether it's the Western life flashes before your eyes or the more Eastern review of one's karma through a book, the life is reviewed. And I think the difference in the two cultures, where in the West we review our own culture, we review our own lives, and in Asia where our lives are reviewed for us, is that in the West we now have a greater amount of autonomy in our own lives. We're accustomed to making our own choices. We're accustomed to doing our own thing, whatever that may be. And it's been that way for, 2 or 3 generations now. Find your dream is one of the slogans that Western people recognize. And in Asia, which is still quite traditional, and in India, which is still dominated by the caste system, at least in the Hindu world, you don't live your dream. You live your father's occupation. And if you're a girl, you live your mother's occupation, which is almost invariably mother and housewife. Now, the next stage of the near-death experience, the next stage of the death process, has been called the transcendent experience. And this can take a number of forms, but the most common are having a tour of heaven, having the secrets of the cosmos explained to you. And this illustration shows Dante's version of a transcendent experience in an illustration by Gustave Doré. There he is standing before heaven, looking into the mighty hosts that sing their hosannas with such blissful tones. And in the illustration on the left, Pramalai, whose book we just looked at a moment ago, is having a tour of Indraloka, the heaven of Indra. They have many heavens, each one arranged on top of the other, the highest of which, being a Buddhist country, is the realm of Buddhas. Here is another illustration that shows a kind of heavenly paradise, which actually is located outside not only of this place, but also of this time. And if your actions on this earth are meritorious enough, you can reincarnate in the time of Sri Arya. Now, Sri just means the honored, and Arya means the virtuous, or actually in some cases, the gentlemanly one. And on the right, you'll see people pulling jewels down from the mani tree, the wish-fulfilling tree. You can go to heaven in this place and pluck gems and jewels from the tree together with your partner of the opposite sex and have yourself a grand old time counting up your wealth. Now, the other heaven, the one on the left, the one I prefer much more, shows everyone with expressions of total fulfillment, both romantic and even sexual, la-di-dying, gently wandering through the streets of heaven, being completely relaxed, not a care in the world, no stress, whatever, and of course, obviously, being fulfilled romantically. And I think that this particular vision of heaven comes from the fact that so few people find real romantic fulfillment on this earth. You find it, but then it's gone. It lasts 3 months or it lasts 60 years, and when it's over, it always seemed like it was just a brief day. And now that I've gone over the various phases of near-death experiences, I can explain to you the basic model that I work with. And that is that religious and mystic experiences are death process phenomena that occur while we're alive. So that if we're dying and we have an out-of-body experience, that's not necessarily a spiritual experience the way most people use the term. That's the death process, and you don't have to be spiritual to die. If you see God on this earth, then you've had the unio mystica. Your prayers have reached some kind of fulfillment. If you find yourself facing the infinite void, you can find that the void often offers imagery that can relate directly to the acquisition of psychic skills. If you're seeing the light, you're in a state of bliss. And this can happen through yoga, prayer, meditation, any one of a number of different means. But the basic repertoire of mystic experience is drawn from the repertoire of death phenomena in order to appear during our lives. Why would a state of consciousness reach its pinnacle with an utterly, absolutely new state of consciousness when our evolutionary heritage has provided us with a ready-made set of mystic experiences that are there organically and that have a natural function? Why create something utterly and absolutely new? So again, mystic experiences are death process phenomena that happen when the death process isn't going on. And this illustration offers a very tidy example of the point. And I wish I could say I knew where this illustration came from or what it's illustrating exactly. I believe it's a picture of a Muslim mystic. But you'll see three elements there. One of them is the light. The light is streaming down on the man who's having this experience. We know this from the light in near-death experiences, the phase of the process, the phase of the death process that tells us that to be dead is blissful. There's nothing to be afraid of. You've come home. You're welcome. Everything is fine. Just behind him, there is a group of spirit beings, kind of shady by comparison to the figure in the foreground. In a near-death experience, these might appear as your dead friends or relatives, people you know who have died. In a near-death experience from Southeast Asia, they might be the other beings being tortured. And I do want to mention that in the near-death experiences from Southeast Asia, and I'm not quite done with this illustration, people witness these tortures, but they never experience them themselves. And there's a woman named Carol Zaleski, who wrote a book called Otherworldly Journeys about near-death experiences in medieval times in the West. And she also found the same thing. People did see tortures, but none of the people who had the experiences were ever tortured themselves. The point of the tortures is not to punish you for your sins. It's to tell you that you're in the land of the dead. And once you accept that, it should be much more possible to move on. And I just want to return to this illustration to point out the other component that implicates it as showing a real mystic experience with its components drawn from near-death experiences, and that is the books at this man's feet. He is surrounded by light. He's got a crowd of spirits behind him, and before him there are books. And books do appear in near-death experiences frequently. During the transcendence experience, which might otherwise be a tour of heaven or hell, someone can find themselves having all the mysteries of the universe revealed to them in a place called the Akashic Records, where there are books that have information that reveal any mystery, however subtle or however hard to access. So the three components that mark this illustration as showing a real mystic experience are also three components that can be found in somewhat different form in near-death experiences. I wish I knew what this story was about, because it is the single most telling image showing how the components of the death process manifest during life, creating mystic experiences. And before I move on to the next part, I do want to take a moment to say what you can do with this kind of information. So perhaps you have accepted everything I've said at face value, which is more than I myself do sometimes. And you accept that somehow when the moment comes for your death that you're going to review your life. What do you do about that? I think that the spiritual practice that is tuned to this understanding the best is the one that Jesus seems to have offered, and many people who came after him definitely did, and that is, repent. The end is at hand. You never know when you're going to die. Sitting there watching this television program, a meteor could come from outer space, put a hole in your roof, punch your heart out where you're sitting right now, this instant, and it's all over. Some strange malfunction in your body could happen right now, and then it's all over. So at any moment, you be prepared to face the fact that you're not going to be here forever. And Jesus' teaching to repent, I think, meant a bit more than simply be sorry for your sins. I think he meant it, and I'm maybe alone in this. This is my opinion about something religious, not necessarily evidence from science. I think he meant something much more active than that. I think he meant look at your life, look at the things that you have done, and ask yourself how you feel about them. Spend time doing those reflections and allow your own emotional responses to your own memories of your own behaviors to shape the way you will act in the future. Was there a person who was suffering that you passed by, and when you think about it, you don't feel so good? There will be another suffering person along very shortly. Respond to them well. Was there someone in need or someone who was vulnerable that you spoke harshly to? How do you feel about it now? Don't worry about it too much. There will be another vulnerable or hurting person to cross your path very soon, and be nicer to them than you were in the past. And use your own reflections, use your own review of your life before you die. And that qualifies it as a mystic experience in my vocabulary to shape the way you live between now and when your end does come. It may not be science for me to say, live well because the end is coming. But I'm a human being, and I want to speak to you from that perspective as well. The simple statement, repent, the end is at hand, whether at hand means 2 minutes or 2 decades from now, is a very profound statement, provided repentance is taken not with a judgment of your actions, but with an imperative to improve them as much as you can. And the more time you spend doing this, the more you will find that your life really does change. I've taken this practice on board myself when I was studying near-death experiences, and I found that although I had many moments when I winced and sort of shriveled a little bit, thinking of some of the things I've done in my past, I now know that I live better now than I ever have, and I wish the same to all of you. So, having said that, let's look at how the brain produces the experience of God, the theme of this talk for tonight. So, to understand how the brain produces the experience of God, we need to look at a few parts of the limbic system, the set of structures deep in the brain. And what we're going to be looking for is to explain visitor experiences of any kind, whether it's angels, like the guardian angel in this classic illustration, which I actually have in my home hung up, or whether we're talking about much more negative things like monsters in the closet or demons under the bed or whatever it happens to be, frightening ghosts that you only see half-formed in the corner of your eye when you wake up in the middle of the night, feeling that sense of foreboding, unpleasantness. Monsters in the closet, guardian angels, are made of the same stuff. And that stuff is to be found in the limbic system. Now, this is a very, very simplified rendering of the limbic system. We have the left amygdala and the right amygdala, the two round structures at the top. The left and the right hippocampus, the cylinders in the middle, and the left and the right caudate nucleus, which are the rather elongated triangles off to each side. At the bottom, we have the dorsal hippocampal commissure and the fornix commissure, and their job is to connect the left and right hippocampus so that the two of them can communicate with one another. And then up at the top, we have the anterior commissure. Anterior just means forward, and commissure just means something that connects between the left and the right amygdala. That's an important brain structure in our discussion here. The anterior commissure has only one job to do, and that is keep the two amygdalas communicating with each other. That's how important they are. Their communication between one another is not shunted through the corpus callosum, the middle structure connecting the two hemispheres that most people have heard of in school. It only connects the amygdala with its overwhelmingly emotional functions. So let's have a look at those functions just briefly. And here it is in our next slide. And the left amygdala is specialized for joy and bliss. The right amygdala is specialized for fear and depression. So fear on the right, joy on the left. On the left, we think in words. That's where the language centers are, Wernicke's area and Broca's area that we saw earlier. And on the right, it does silent thinking, thinking without words. That can be, if you're a musician, that can be pitch, tone, rhythm, harmony, melody, counterpoint, and so forth. If you're an artist, it can be form, color, shapes, and so forth. If you're a cook, it can be texture, taste. We use this silent thinking structure for all sorts of things. And taking a last look at this particular illustration, on the left side with the caudate nucleus, we have arousal, the state of the body's state of excitement with things like anger, sex, joy, little kids bouncing around when they get good news, very much of the left caudate nucleus. The right caudate nucleus is about relaxation. And I'm going to ask you to keep focused on this for just a moment. Think about it. Relaxation, silent thinking, and depression are all on the right. When you're depressed, you can get relaxed to the point where you're lethargic, where you can actually have trouble dragging yourself out of bed. And the words do not come freely. All of that is right hemispheric stuff. On the left, we have joy. arousal and thinking in words. We get good news, and it's something that really makes us very happy, extremely happy. And our bodies can actually become aroused. You get a good piece of news, you might have to stand up. It's hard to be relaxed when something's happened that's made you very, very happy. If the source of that joy or that bliss is coming from something spiritual, you may have the urge to shout it from the rooftops. You may find yourself with a compelling need to express your insight and understanding and your experience in words. People who have frequent spiritual experiences without the guidance of experienced spiritual teachers sometimes fill ream after ream of journals and notebooks. Again, joy, arousal, and thinking in words are all on the same side of the brain. There's a logic, a sense that this arrangement makes. And it's going to be important as we discuss how the brain makes the experience of God. So, moving on. It begins with fear. The amygdala on the right side gets somewhat active and we're feeling fear, anxiety, or alternately it could be sadness. The amygdala on the right begins to get a bit active, shown in this illustration as being somewhat filled with red stuff, representing neural activation. The other structures on the right side of the brain are also active, but not deeply so. The next one, we find that the level of fear has gone up. Now the amygdala on the right, the fear structure, is very nearly full, and the hippocampus on the right, the nonverbal structure, is even more full, showing it to be more active. We've now got real fear and a real ability to find words for things. The person is either scared to the point where they can't speak, or they're depressed to the point where the words won't come. The next phase, we find that the right amygdala is almost full. The right hippocampus is almost full. The caudate nucleus on the right side is really getting active. The person is now terror-struck into immobility. Words will not come. They're at a total loss for words. If it's fear they're feeling, they're in a state of terror. If it's depression they're feeling, they're in a state of anguish or absolute despair. The system is almost completely maxed out. It's worth noting that these experiences can come from anywhere. The fear that you're seeing in that illustration, that can come from within the brain through a sort of normal garden variety anxiety attack. It could appear because something from outside the person has actually filled them with real fear, as for example a tiger starting to eat them, or a bus that's at full speed and is only 3 feet from you without time to escape. It doesn't matter where the terror comes from. The mechanism is the same. And now we come to the next phase. The right amygdala is now full. The right hippocampus is now full. There is absolute inner silence. The despair is total. The fear, the terror has moved to the point of impending doom. The right caudate nucleus is now so active that the person has gone literally limp with fear. The limbic system on the right side is maxed out. And this is a good time to notice, for me to say, that the caudate nucleus behaves this way according to a theory of mine, and is not, there's nothing in mainstream neuroscience to conflict with it, but it's not a commonly held theory. Now we come to the last part. Now the amygdala, the one with the lowest threshold in the brain, dumps its activity over into the left side of the brain. And here we see it in the illustration with the purple. And now instead of terror, fear, despair, we get bliss, the experience of light, which, by the way, Dr. Persinger has elicited, stimulating the amygdala on the right side with that amygdala signal embedded in a magnetic field, and the experience of God. But the amygdala is the one with the lowest thresholds. So let's have another quick look at this illustration while I point something out to you. And that is that the amygdala, being the one with the lowest threshold, is the one that's easiest to activate. It responds more readily than other parts of the brain. So the hippocampus on the right doesn't need to dump its load, and the hippocampus knows all kinds of things without words. So now here's a moment where all sorts of nonverbal information is available to the person at the same moment as they are filled with bliss, with the presence of God, with light, with radiance, with joy. And now that left caudate nucleus is active and the person is jumping up and down. They have been there, they have seen, God has visited them, and they are now qualified to shout it from the rooftops, to write their own scriptures, and to share this with the world, which often happens when people have these kinds of experiences. They have a sense that they've been given something precious and subtle. And just as God knows everything, the experience of God that comes up this way, and as far as I know it's the only way, is filled with all kinds of subtle nonverbal information from the right hippocampus, so that they, in the moment when they meet God, have the sense of all kinds of subtle and enduring deep mysteries of the cosmos, of God, and of themselves revealed. God knows everything, but much of it is not in words. Now, how do you get from a person who sees God to someone who is then a lifetime mystic? And this is often the pattern. If a person has a first-hand experience of God, it can shape the rest of their lives. And from then on, they are a mystic with a capital M. They are a religious teacher with a capital R. They are spiritual leaders. They may not articulate their message well, but they have a message to share. And they're never, ever the same people again. So what's the difference in the brain that makes this difference in personality before and after seeing God? And here we'll look at the illustration. The top is before. Earlier I pointed out a structure and told you that it was important, the anterior commissure. And it's been said that the way the brain makes functions of any kind happen is by creating the function. Now, early in our evolutionary history, very early. And then it creates a way of inhibiting it. Then it creates an inhibition to the inhibition, also known as a disinhibition. Then it creates an inhibition to the disinhibition that inhibits the original inhibition that inhibits the function. The brain works by layers by having everything on all the time, unless it is specifically told to be off, so that everything's working all the time. They say we only use 10% of our brains. That other 90% is there for neurological headroom, which we need in order to stay healthy and sane. But it's also there because much of it is busy monitoring what's going on in our brains and monitoring the world around us in order to choose what to inhibit or what to disinhibit. If we used 100% of our brains, we'd be in a lot of pain, and we'd probably be in a state known as status epilepticus, the ongoing epileptic seizure, because that would be the only way to get 100% of your brain operating at once. We wouldn't stay there long, and then we'd die. So let's return to this illustration after that brief aside, and you will see that on the top, before, there is communication in both directions, from the right amygdala to the left and the left amygdala to the right, in equal amounts. Actually, the amount is never equal, and it changes from one brain to the next. Very happy people have more communication from the right to the left, so that the left gets more going in, and very unhappy people the other direction, so that the right one, the right amygdala, the fearful amygdala, the depressed, the despairing amygdala, has more communication running into it. But let's pretend we have a balanced midline brain. At the top, the communication is running both ways. At the bottom, after, that is to say, after an enormous jolt of neurological activity has moved from the right to the left, those synapses that inhibited activation, moving from right to left, from fear to joy, get stripped away. So that after that, experiences that would otherwise initiate fear, initiate the right amygdala, can then be shunted over into the left amygdala, so that things that would create fear, create depression or despair, can be turned into joy, elation, and bliss. So that a person who's seen God, on being told that they will die, that earlier utterly threatening statement, finds no threat in it at all. A person who has seen God and has had their brain rearranged in this very unusual, but perhaps desirable in evolutionary terms, way, can find themselves having positive responses to negative events. Once that set of inhibitory synapses from the right amygdala to the left have been torn away, or at least just pruned, it's no longer possible for a person to go into negativity the way they used to. And just as they say it's darkest before the dawn, these people can find a dawn at the edge of any darkness, and they are a source of tremendous inspiration to the people around them. So I hope that makes it all clear how the brain changes when you have seen God, why seeing God is a process that lasts the rest of your life, even though it only took a couple of minutes. Remember Dr. Persinger's comment earlier, religious and mystic experiences can be brief, very transient, lasting just a few seconds, focal displays deep in the temporal lobes. Those few seconds change your life so that afterwards you are no longer you. Remember, these are the same structures that are involved in maintaining the sense of self. So when they change to allow a bit more God in, you change along with it. If God touches you, whether you believe God is in the brain or God is in the cosmos, if God touches you, you will never be the same person again. And hallelujah, Hosanna, may it happen to everyone out there in television land. In appropriate measure, of course. So, let's have a look at a few case histories. I've given you the pattern. Fear, despair, angst, terror, followed by bliss, joy, elation, love, light, and God. So, if this is the case, then the classical stories of visions of God from the world's history should bear this out. To underscore the point that the trigger for this can be different for different people. Wildly different circumstances can initiate that fear and anxiety. I'm going to start off, as I have here in this slide, with a vision of God from Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon religion. And Joseph Smith had a terrible problem. Now, to us today, it doesn't seem like much of a problem, certainly not enough to go into despair about, but it drove him nuts. And that is that he couldn't decide what denomination he wanted to be. He knew he wanted to be a Christian, but he couldn't tell whether he wanted to be a Catholic, a Presbyterian, an Episcopalian, or to choose from any of the other religions that were available in the middle of the 19th century out on the western frontier. And this decision really tore him apart. It got to the point where he actually went into serious despair because he felt a real spiritual urge in himself. He wanted to be connected with God. It was not an idle point with him. It's not like going to church or not going to church, for insurance in case the Catholics are right or the Baptists are right. He needed to feel God through his church, and he needed to feel fellowship through his congregation. Now, when everyone lived on homesteads and you only saw other people on Sunday when you went to church or when you went into town, which invariably meant spending or receiving cash money, those didn't happen too often. The sheer importance of your church fellowship is beyond the understanding of most people today. And this reached the point where he finally got himself into such a state that it broke. And God appeared before him, or actually an angel appeared before him. And that angel, whose name escapes me at this moment, conveyed to him his job, his work in the world, his purpose was as a prophet, and told him that in a certain place he would find a book with golden pages that would have a new scripture on it. And Joseph Smith, by all accounts, found the book, and then working with this angel through a direct transmission, he was able to have his communications with God and angels regularly after that, because his brain had been changed, and was able to translate this book, and it is now the Book of Mormon, available at your favorite bookseller or Mormon church. Now, let's take a big cross in traditions here. This picture is of Ramakrishna Paramhamsa, and he is a famous mystic from India. And the story is that when he was worshiping Mother Kali, that is to say Kali Ma, or the goddess Kali, he began to ask himself why, if he was worshiping a living goddess, why would she not respond to his worship? And this question nagged him day and night. Then he began to pray to Kali, "Mother, you've been gracious to many devotees in the past, and you have revealed yourself to them. Why would you not reveal yourself to me also? Am I not also your son?" He would weep bitterly and sometimes even cry out loudly while worshiping. One day he was impatient to see Mother Kali. He was so impatient to see Mother Kali that he decided to end his life. Despair to the point of suicide. He seized the swords hanging on the wall of the temple, because the sword is a ritual object belonging to the goddess Kali, and was about to strike himself with it when suddenly he saw light issuing from the deity, or also called the murti, the idol in the temple, and this light came over him in waves. He was overwhelmed by those waves, and from then after he was in regular, if not constant, contact with the goddess Kali, the goddess of his choice. And he's also one of the most famous spiritual teachers that India has ever produced. Ramakrishna Paramhamsa. Paramhamsa means the ultimate swan, because the swan lives in the sky, it swims on the water and can duck under the water, going, however superficially, into the underworld, and it walks on land, so it traverses all three worlds. And it's also white, making it a symbol of purity. The goddess Kali herself can be drenched in blood, and at one time in India, her ritual worship included drenching her in blood. But for Ramakrishna, she was nothing but purity and whiteness and love. He called her Mother Kali because he found the sacred presence, the sacred mood of motherhood coming from her. The next one is a little bit different, and I include it here because it offers a rare kind of exception to the rule, and every rule does have some exceptions. And this is Sister Faustina Kowalska, the Blessed Faustina. She was in fact beatified, which is a little bit different from being made a saint by one of the popes. And in her case, she had a vision once that began with her dancing. Instead of it beginning with fear and anguish and despair, it began with her being happy. And the activity was shunted over into the right side of the brain. She still got a vision of God, but it was a vision of the tortured Jesus, the Jesus with his body covered in wounds, the crown of thorns on his head, in enormous, unspeakable pain. This image is still popular in some Latin American renditions, and that was what she was confronted with, a bloody, tortured man filled with pain after feeling happy. So for her, the pattern was reversed. But for her, it didn't stop there. In this state of anguish, because Jesus had said something to her that made her upset, it was as though, and I don't remember the exact words, but it was as though she was failing in her duty to her God. And this filled her with anguish and despair, activating the amygdala on the right through more organic, natural means. She went into a church in this state of anguish and prostrated herself before the altar. She prayed to God to reveal his plan for her, and then heard the voice of God telling her to go and enter a convent. Actually, the voice of God told her to go to Warsaw. She was Polish. And there you will enter a convent. And without question, without any lapse in her faith, she got on the next train that she could, went to Warsaw without any money in her pocket, and within a few hours had found a place for herself to stay, and within a few days was accepted into a convent. Another example, Blessed Sister Josefina Menendez. She heard the voice of God regularly. This is another blessed. She was beatified but not yet made into a saint. She heard God's voice and went into despair at the thought that God was angry with her. She stayed that way until one morning, after a night of anguish, she saw him, all beautiful, standing vested in white, holding his heart in his hands, shining with radiant light. His hair was like spun gold, and the wounds of his crucifixion shone like little suns. The next example is perhaps better known to many Americans, and that is Neil David Walsh, the author of Conversations with God. His tribulations began when he was hit by a car, and his neck was he had to wear a neck brace. He lost his job while he was recovering, and no one was going to hire a man wearing a neck brace, especially if he fell off his chair at the office. It could paralyze him for life. Who wants to pick up the liability? He became unemployable. He was too sick to hold a job behind a desk, but oddly enough, he wasn't too sick to live in a tent in a park and collect bottles and cans for his livelihood, which he managed to do without going into paralysis or a coma or something like that. Well, finally the neck brace came off. He'd been working in radio, and he got himself a job working one Saturday afternoon a week at a local radio station in Oregon. And he began to pull himself up. First, he just held the job, spent the money on food, and enjoyed hot pizza from the pizza parlor instead of pizza from the garbage. He bought some of his homeless friends a couple of drinks here and there, gave them a little bit. Then he started saving money to get himself a house. Got the house. Stepped over the threshold. Now I have a roof over my head. I live like normal people. There is a refrigerator and it has some food. It's not full, but it has food. I'm gonna come out of this. I'm not going to end my life as a homeless person. And I don't have my neck brace anymore. Then he went to work one day and found a sign that says, out of business, gone bankrupt. And the whole thing fell apart. His first despair was not the deepest one. It was when he began to work himself up and the rug was pulled out of him that he then fell down again the hardest. He went home and collapsed on his couch, and then he started hearing the voice of God saying to him, have you had enough yet? And when he finally came past his disbelief enough to be able to answer the voice he heard, this voice went on to reveal to him another set of religious teachings. Have you had enough yet? It's because you are the one who created your own suffering. And his book, Conversations of God, is filled with this theme and is probably one of the most subtle and broadest in scope works of modern theology. And it's actually quite original. He didn't grab it from anyone else. We have only a couple of more case histories here. One of them is Teresa of Avila. I don't know what her disease was. Her disease was possibly her doctor's. She was in severe pain, unable to eat. There was a month when she could not move her body at all except for her little finger. And then she was being given purges. Doctors would come in, fill her stomach with water, and force her to vomit. And this happened every day for a month. She began to have visions of God in this period, so exquisite she could hardly bring herself to describe them. His soft whiteness infused with radiance which delights the eye. And the last example of visions of God that I have to offer is God. Jesus, when he went into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, met Satan, the Lord of evil himself. And here we see him being tempted by Satan to free himself from a pinnacle by jumping and relying on angels to break his fall. Quoting something from the Old Testament that says that angels shall bear thee up in thy hands. Turn the stones into bread. Jesus said, man does not live by bread alone. Get thee behind me, Satan, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. And then the next episode in Jesus' life finds him in Jerusalem teaching for the first time. We don't know what happened between this meeting with Satan and the beginning of his ministry. I want to guess that what happened was an apotheosis, a religious experience so intense that he began to literally experience himself as God. So, the experience of God is driven by the amygdala, a social brain structure. By itself, it will get you bliss, light, and love, the other attributes of God. Even heavenly fragrances, the perfumes of heaven come from the amygdala's connection to the olfactory bulbs just inside our noses. The right hippocampus gets you God's infinite knowledge. It's a cognitive thinking structure, and on the right it thinks without words. On the left it thinks with words, but it does things like spatial perception and memory, dreams where we create entire worlds for ourselves, making it easy for us to have the idea that God creates the universe, because our right hippocampus creates inner worlds that we see every night when we go to sleep and have decent dreams. I could offer one or two more. There are many, many more beyond that, but that's about the end of it. And in closing, I would offer to those people who believe in God, go on believing in God. And remember that if you find yourself in pain, suffering, and your prayers are going unanswered, it may be because God will answer your prayers later. It may be because he is teaching something through suffering. And as we've just seen, powerful things can be learned through suffering. So respect your God, because he seems not to accept your prayers this moment. And for those who do believe in God, who don't believe in God, and believe that the experience of God is nothing but a matter for the brain, that doesn't mean that you need not pray, that you cannot separate your two senses of self into discrete entities that you may or may not experience directly, but that can give you new insights into things that are on your mind while you're praying. I pray every day. My personal belief is that God is mostly a matter of the brain. I believe, like many Hindus and Buddhists, that if I'm face to face with God, I'll be facing a portion of myself. and that it comes from the brain, but that doesn't stop me from praying. And I find great fulfillment in it, and I find all kinds of new insights, hope, peace, and all sorts of spiritual values without necessarily believing in a traditional God. So my word to you who don't believe in God is, may God bless you